The blazing brilliance of the grand mansion's diamond chandeliers did nothing to melt the ice that suddenly smothered the room in a heavy, suffocating paralysis. The city's most lethal shadow, a man who normally commanded empires and executed enemies without blinking, didn't even glance at the skeletal heiresses or the desperate debutantes vying for his favor. Instead, his heavily inked, powerful hands locked onto the generous waist of a voluptuous maid in a light blue dress, hauling her directly onto his thighs, right in the center of his own engagement gala. The live orchestra choked to a dead stop. Half-raised crystal chalices remained frozen in midair. In that single, gravity-defying heartbeat, the social hierarchy of the elite was utterly incinerated. The sprawling ballroom was a dizzying vortex of liquid gold, silk trains, and arrogant, inherited luxury. Sandra Miller stood flat-footed near the heavy velvet kitchen drapery, the comms unit in her ear crackling with the frantic, high-pitched orders of the head butler. At 26, Sandra was a seasoned domestic worker for elite household staffing, a position that demanded she operate with flawless precision while remaining completely ghostly. She smoothed the fabric of her uniform over her soft, full curves, shifting her weight against the biting ache in her heels. She was acutely aware of how she registered in this sanctuary of privilege, a human blind spot. To the politicians and trust fund magnates swirling vintage champagne, Sandra's heavy, voluptuous body was merely a structural pillar, an invisible boundary of the servant class that they looked straight through as if she were made of thin air. "Sandra, we have an emergency at the head table," her co-worker's voice hissed frantically through the receiver. "The Jacobson family is throwing a fit about the presentation of the truffles." Sandra let out a slow, controlled breath, pinching the bridge of her nose to stave off a headache. "I'm on it. Just keep the silver trays immaculate for the main course. Not a single fingerprint." She glided into the glittering crowd with a quiet, practiced dignity, a grace carved out over years of learning how to maneuver a larger, softer frame through a world built exclusively for the painfully starved. She slipped effortlessly between the linen-draped tables, her steps silent and intentional. She didn't resent her invisibility. She used it as a shield. In a room suffocated by surgical perfection and hollow vanity, her solid, heavy reality kept her anchored. But as the night deepened, the rhythm of the ballroom warped. It wasn't just the usual low hum of old money snobbery anymore. A sudden, razor-sharp current of collective dread sliced right through the ambient chatter. The massive, hand-carved mahogany doors at the formal entrance opened, and the air in the room instantly turned to ash. Sandra stopped dead in her tracks, a heavy silver tray balanced perfectly atop her palms. Santiago Dominguez had arrived. The heavy cotton of the maid's uniform was designed to erase her, but on Sandra Miller, it only seemed to draw a map of everything high society despised. At 26, her size 20 frame stretched the seams of the starch-stiff fabric, a constant physical reminder that she did not fit into the narrow, skeletal world of her employers. Every shift at elite household staffing felt like a grueling marathon of endurance. Her lower back throbbed from hours of polishing mahogany, and her feet burned inside her flat shoes. Yet the physical toll was nothing compared to the weight of the glances that cut through her. In the eyes of the billionaires who populated these sprawling penthouses, her full, voluptuous curves weren't just an inconvenience. They were a moral failing, an intentional eyesore in their sanctuaries of pristine, hollow perfection. "Move your massive frame out of the lighting, girl. You're casting a shadow over the seating chart," a prominent real estate mogul had snapped at her earlier that morning, not even granting her the dignity of looking her in the eye. To them, she was a clumsy, oversized appliance that somehow breathed. Sandra internalized every cruel whisper, every sharp sneer from the rail-thin women who glided past her smelling of expensive French perfume and casual malice. She had learned to shrink her posture, to duck her head, and let her dark hair fall forward like curtains to shield her face. She accepted the microaggressions as a mandatory tax for the crime of taking up space while poor. She needed this job desperately, to chip away at her family's suffocating medical debts, so she wore her invisibility like a lead apron, drowning her insecurities in absolute, silent efficiency. If she could just remain a ghost, she could survive. But as she adjusted the tight collar of her dress in the mirror of the service pantry, watching the faint tremble in her own fingers, Sandra had no idea that her carefully constructed armor of invisibility was about to be violently ripped away. The grand ballroom suddenly lost its warmth as the heavy, hand-carved mahogany doors swung open. It wasn't a gradual shift, it was an instant, bone-chilling drop in temperature that made the classical musicians falter on their strings. Sandra, tucked deep into the shadows near a towering marble pillar, felt the hairs on her arms stand up before she even saw him. The low, arrogant chatter of the old money crowd died down into a reverent, terrified murmur. Santiago Dominguez did not merely walk into the room, he dominated it with a dark, predatory stillness. Tall and impossibly broad, his bespoke charcoal suit clung perfectly to his powerful frame, but it was the intricate, dark ink creeping up his throat and wrapping around his jawline that marked him as something entirely lethal. He was dangerous money, the undisputed monarch of the city's underworld. Sandra gripped the edge of her silver tray, trying to focus on the catering crisis unfolding at her fingertips, a chaotic mess of spilled vintage champagne and disrupted hors d'oeuvres that her panicked manager was screaming about through her earpiece. Yet, her eyes were drawn to him like a moth to a flame. Beside Santiago stood Michelle Jacobson, his fiancée. Michelle was the epitome of high society vanity, rail-thin, poured into a dripping emerald gown, and radiating an icy, suffocating entitlement. But as Sandra watched from the veil of the shadows, she noticed something the rest of the fawning crowd missed. There was no passion between the golden couple. When Michelle reached out to drape her slender, manicured hand over Santiago's arm, his posture remained rigidly detached. His cold, calculating eyes didn't even flicker toward her. It was entirely transactional, a calculated merger of old wealth and raw, terrifying power. Michelle looked at him like a prized possession to be flaunted, while Santiago looked at the entire room, including his future bride, with the utter boredom of a king surrounded by parasites. Sandra let out a shaky breath, pressing herself further into the darkness, completely unaware that the Ice King's gaze was already scanning the room, searching for something real. The air in the VIP lounge was thick with the scent of burning tobacco and suffocating elitism. Sandra stepped forward with careful, measured steps, her eyes strictly lowered as she carried a heavy crystal tray bearing a vintage bottle of scotch and heavy-bottomed tumblers. She could feel Michelle Jacobson's sharp, venomous gaze tracking her full figure, a sneer twisting the fiancé's perfectly plumped lips. Frustrated by Santiago's absolute icy indifference to her presence, Michelle chose the easiest, most defenseless target in the room to reassert her dominance. As Sandra leaned over slightly to set the tray on the mahogany table, Michelle casually and deliberately extended her stiletto-clad foot directly into Sandra's path. Sandra's flat shoe caught the sharp heel. With a sharp gasp, her ankle twisted violently. The heavy crystal tray slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the table in a brutal eruption of shattering glass and amber liquid. Sandra felt her center of gravity vanish. She braced herself for the humiliating impact of hitting the floor, knowing her large body would make a terrible sound, knowing the entire room of 300 aristocrats would turn and laugh. But the floor never came. Before she could register the fall, a large, incredibly strong hand shot out. Long, heavily tattooed fingers wrapped around her waist with crushing, possessive force. Santiago Dominguez didn't just catch her. With a fluid, terrifyingly powerful motion, he used her momentum to pull her directly onto his lap. Sandra landed squarely against a wall of solid muscle, her heart hammering wildly as his steel-like arm banded around her waist, anchoring her thick, curved thigh against his chest. The shattering glass was the last sound in the grand ballroom. The music died. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Michelle's jaw unhinged, all color draining from her face as she stared at her fiancé holding the chubby maid. Santiago didn't look at the mess. He looked down at Sandra's panicked face, his dark eyes intense. Then, he lifted his freezing gaze to Michelle. "Apologize to her," Santiago commanded, his voice a low, lethal baritone that vibrated through the silent room. "What?" Michelle choked out. "She's just a clumsy—" I said, "Apologize loudly to the woman on my lap, Michelle," Santiago growled, his grip on Sandra tightening. "Now, or your family loses everything before sunrise." The silence in the grand ballroom was suffocating. Sandra sat frozen on Santiago's lap, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his solid chest, acutely aware of the hundreds of elite eyes staring in absolute horror. "Santiago, please." "This is absurd." Arthur Jacobson, Michelle's billionaire father, stepped forward, shoving his way past the velvet ropes. His face was flushed crimson, sweat glinting on his forehead. "She's a clumsy servant. Michelle made a minor mistake, but you cannot humiliate my daughter over a fat girl in a uniform. Think of our family's merger." Santiago's dark eyes shifted to the older man, his expression completely devoid of humanity. He didn't raise his voice, but the low, granular baritone cut through the room like a blade. "The merger is dead, Arthur. And so is this transactional farce of an engagement. If your daughter ever uses her feet for anything other than walking out of my sight, I will personally dismantle your family's entire legacy." Michelle let out a humiliated, choked sob, clutching her father's arm as the surrounding socialites began to whisper in a frantic, buzzing swarm. "Mr. Dominguez, sir, I am so profoundly sorry for this absolute incompetence." A sharp, panicked voice broke through the tension. It was Thomas Vance, the regional director of elite household staffing. He practically sprinted into the VIP section, shooting Sandra a look of pure venom. "This is entirely unacceptable. Sandra, get off Mr. Dominguez this instant. You are making a grotesque spectacle of yourself. You are fired. Pack your things and get out." Sandra felt the floor drop out from under her. Fired. She needed this job for her family's debts. But before defeat could fully wash over her, Santiago's jaw clenched. The muscles in his thighs tightened beneath her, and a raw, coiled violence radiated from his frame. "Did I ask for your intervention, Vance?" Santiago asked softly. Thomas froze, his subservient smile faltering. No, sir. But she ruined your— She was assaulted by a guest you are paid to secure," Santiago interrupted, his voice laced with razor-sharp ice, as he signaled his massive, armed bodyguards to step forward, forming an impenetrable wall around the booth. "She doesn't work for you anymore, because if she did, I would have to burn your entire agency to the ground for failing to keep her safe. Consider her employment terminated by mutual agreement." Before Sandra could process the words, Santiago shifted his grip to her hips. He slid one massive arm under her knees and wrapped the other firmly around her back. With a smooth, effortless exertion of power, he lifted her entirely off the ground. Sandra gasped, instinctively throwing her arms around his thick neck, as the city's most dangerous man carried his chubby maid right out of the grand ballroom, leaving the high society elite in absolute, breathless ruin. The biting November wind vanished the moment the heavy, vacuum-sealed door of the armored Rolls-Royce shut with a muted thud, cutting off the chaotic murmurs of the mansion behind them. Sandra scrambled across the expansive plush leather interior, trying to put as much distance between herself and the terrifying man beside her as the spacious back seat allowed. Her hands were still trembling as she rubbed her swollen ankle, her mind racing through the sheer madness of the last 10 minutes. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, a sharp spike of adrenaline finally shattering her silence. "You just ruined a multi-billion-dollar merger, humiliated your own fiancée, threatened my boss, and kidnapped me. What do you want from me?" Santiago remained perfectly unbothered, calmly pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water from the car's built-in console. When she refused to take one, he set it down and unbuttoned his tailored jacket. "I didn't kidnap you, Sandra. I pulled you out of a collapsing building." "The mansion wasn't collapsing," she snapped, her breath ragged. "Not physically," Santiago replied, his low baritone incredibly steady as he leaned back. "In exactly 8 minutes, a tactical federal unit is going to raid that gala. They are locking the doors, confiscating the servers, and arresting the entire senior management of elite household staffing." Sandra stared at him, the air leaving her lungs. What? Why? Because your boss, Thomas Vance, has been using the agency to launder cartel cash for the Jacobson family for the last 3 years, Santiago stated matter-of-factly. The inflated catering bills, the ghost staff payrolls, the falsified vendor fees. It was a sloppy operation, and the feds finally caught on. A cold dread washed over Sandra. The strange accounting discrepancies she had noticed, the frantic, midnight inventory changes Vance always forced her to sign off on. It all clicked together with horrifying clarity. Oh my God, I'm the lead coordinator. My name is on half of those logistics logs. They'll think I'm part of it. They would have, Santiago agreed, his intense dark eyes locking onto her. Which is exactly why you needed to be extracted dramatically before midnight. You were fired publicly, violently, and in front of 300 elite witnesses. Your connection to that firm is legally and practically severed. Sandra blinked, processing the staggering truth. It hadn't just been a powerful man throwing a temper tantrum over a clumsy maid. It was a meticulously timed rescue. You orchestrated that entire scene to save me. But why? I'm just a maid. Santiago reached across the seat, his large, inked hand settling with a warm, possessive weight on her uninjured calf. Because you are the only competent person in that entire house, Sandra. I've been watching you manage my corporate events for 6 months. You are brilliant. You don't break under pressure, and you don't fawn over the wealth. I despise the hollow, starving sycophants in my world. I prefer reality, and starting tomorrow, you're running my empire. The private elevator glided to a silent halt, its doors sliding open to reveal a breathtaking penthouse wrapped in dark stone, leather, and polished steel. Sandra barely registered the minimalist luxury of the space as Santiago gently guided her onto an oversized plush velvet sofa. "Mateo," Santiago called out, his voice low but commanding. A sharp-suited man stepped out from the shadows of the hallway immediately. "Get Dr. Bennett to look at her ankle. And turn on the news." The massive flat-screen television on the far wall hummed to life. Instantly, a breaking news banner flashed across the screen in stark, aggressive red letters. FBI raids elite household staffing at Jacobson Gala. Multiple arrests in high-profile money laundering sting. Sandra gasped, pressing her trembling fingers over her mouth. The screen flickered to live footage of federal agents in windbreakers cordoning off the very ballroom she had been standing in less than 30 minutes ago. She watched in stunned silence as Thomas Vance, her former boss, was shoved into the back of a federal vehicle in handcuffs, his face completely pale and terrified. "They locked down the building at exactly midnight," Santiago murmured, stepping up behind the sofa. He calmly unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the intricate dark ink twisting down his muscular forearms. "If you had been inside, your signature on those logistics logs would have landed your name on a federal indictment by sunrise. You'd be facing 10 years in a maximum security facility." Sandra couldn't take her eyes off the flashing screen. Her entire life had almost been incinerated. "The Jacobsons, you said they were laundering money. If you tipped off the feds, they're going to know it was you. Let them know," Santiago said, a dangerous edge of dark anticipation in his tone. He walked around the sofa, crouching down slowly until his intense, heavy-lidded eyes were dead level with hers. "Dismantling their operations is my business, Sandra, not yours. Your business is running my legal empire." Sandra swallowed hard, the sheer proximity of him making her breath hitch. He smelled of expensive scotch, cedar wood, and pure, raw power. "I'm a maid, Santiago. I don't know how to run a mafia empire. I have enough criminals on my payroll," Santiago countered smoothly, his large, rough hand gently cupping her jaw to tilt her face up. His thumb brushed over her skin with possessive warmth. "What I need is a gatekeeper I can trust, someone who understands high society logistics and won't crumble under the pressure of wealthy, entitled parasites. You will be my executive estate director. Your starting salary will be exactly 10 times what Vance was paying you." Looking into his uncompromising eyes, Sandra felt a strange, undeniable spark of validation drown out her old insecurities. For the first time in her life, someone didn't look at her size or her status and see a flaw. They saw armor. The heavy, suffocating cotton of her maid's uniform was a ghost of the past. 4 weeks later, standing at the apex of the grand marble staircase, inside the soaring atrium of the Dominguez Syndicate's newest luxury high-rise, Sandra Miller was entirely transformed. She wore her new reality like a second skin. Her breathtaking, custom-tailored burgundy silk gown draped flawlessly over her voluptuous figure, hugging her generous hips and accentuating the full curve of her bust. For 26 years, she had been taught to hide her size, to shrink away from the harsh lights of high society. Tonight, however, her curves were not a liability. They were her armor. Her dark hair was swept up in a sharp, elegant twist, and her posture was impeccably straight. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was undeniable. The grand real estate launch was a masterful display of power and wealth, heavily populated by the very elites who used to look right through her. Now, as Sandra glided across the polished marble floor, conversations hushed. Billionaires and socialites parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with a mixture of profound awe and primal fear. They knew exactly who she was: Santiago Dominguez, Executive Estate Director, the untouchable queen of his legitimate operations. "Miss Miller, the mayor is asking if we can adjust the seating arrangement for the press briefing," a junior coordinator whispered nervously, holding out a digital tablet. "No," Sandra replied smoothly, her voice calm and fiercely authoritative. "The mayor will sit exactly where he was placed. If he objects, politely inform him his invitation can be rescinded." "Right away, ma'am." Sandra took a slow, grounding breath, savoring the intoxicating rush of absolute control. She was never truly alone in the crowd. Just a few paces behind her, Mateo and 3 heavily armed silent security operatives moved like predatory shadows, guaranteeing that no one would ever dare disrespect her again. And standing on the mezzanine above, watching her every move with dark, consuming hunger, was Santiago. He leaned casually against the glass railing, a glass of amber scotch in his hand. Whenever their eyes met across the glittering room, the raw, possessive heat in his gaze reminded her that she wasn't just running his empire, she was rapidly becoming the heart of it. The thrumming bass of the Gala faded into a distant hum as Sandra stepped into the quiet luxury of the executive suite to retrieve the final contract modifications. She reached for the desk, but the sudden, sharp click of a locking door made the hairs on her neck stand on end. From the darkness of the window alcove stepped Julian Jacobson, Michelle's volatile, unhinged brother. His tuxedo was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and swimming with manic fury. The once proud billionaire family had been ruined by the federal raid, and Julian smelled heavily of cheap desperation and expensive bourbon. "You fat, pathetic little parasite," Julian snarled, his voice a jagged whisper as he yanked a snub-nosed revolver from his jacket, pressing the cold steel barrel directly under Sandra's chin. "My family lost everything because Costa chose a servant over my sister. You think you're a queen now? You're a placeholder in a pretty dress." Sandra's heart slammed against her ribs, but the submissive maid who would have wept and apologized was gone. She held his crazed gaze, keeping her posture rigid, despite the terrifying chill of the metal digging into her skin. "Put the gun down, Julian. You won't leave this building alive." "I don't care," he hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "As long as I take." The heavy mahogany door didn't just open. It exploded inward, splintering off its hinges with a deafening crash. Santiago stood in the frame, his face twisted into a mask of absolute, demonic butchery. Before Julian could even swing his weapon, Santiago crossed the room with terrifying, predatory speed. A heavy, ink-covered hand wrapped around Julian's wrist, twisting it backward with a sickening, wet crunch. Julian screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony as the revolver clattered uselessly to the hardwood floor. Santiago didn't stop. He grabbed Julian by the throat, slamming his body over the executive desk, shattering the glass top into a million glittering shards. Santiago pulled a heavy combat knife from his jacket, his eyes completely black, with murderous intent, as he pressed the edge against Julian's throat. "You brought steel into my house," Santiago whispered, his voice dangerously calm, yet vibrating with a lethal rage that shook the room. "You put your hands on my woman." "Santiago, wait," Sandra gasped, her adrenaline crashing as she reached out, placing a hand on Santiago's massive, trembling shoulder. "Don't kill him here. Don't ruin tonight." At the touch of her hand, the demonic storm in Santiago's eyes focused. He struck Julian hard with the butt of the knife, knocking him instantly unconscious. Dropping the weapon, Santiago spun around and hauled Sandra into his arms, pulling her heavy frame tightly against his chest. His breathing was ragged, his hands fiercely roaming over her back and waist to check for injuries. "I've got you," he growled against her neck, his voice raw with an overwhelming emotion she had never heard from him before. He pulled back, cupping her face in his large, tattooed palms. "You aren't just an executive, Sandra. You are my life, and I will burn this city to ash before I let anyone touch you again." The private dining room of Les Bernardins was closed to the public, the air inside suffocatingly thick with the scent of stale espresso and impending doom. Arthur Jacobson sat flanked by his remaining capos, looking like a hollowed-out ghost of his former billionaire self. His empire was bleeding out. When the heavy mahogany doors swung open, Arthur's desperate eyes narrowed. Santiago Dominguez walked in, radiating quiet, lethal authority in a black Tom Ford suit. But he wasn't the one commanding the room. It was Sandra. Walking beside Santiago, Sandra wore her size 20 frame, like a suit of unyielding armor. Her crimson wrap dress hugged her full curves beautifully, and a blindingly expensive diamond collar rested against her skin, Santiago's latest tribute. She opened her leather portfolio, looking directly into Arthur's panicked eyes without a single trace of her old submissive fear. "Mr. Jacobson," Sandra said, her voice smooth, steady, and sharp enough to cut glass. "These are the routing numbers for your family's hidden shell corporations in the Caymans, the ones you were laundering cash through using my old catering agency. As of an hour ago, the SEC has frozen every single one of them based on an anonymous, deeply detailed logistical breakdown I submitted." Arthur blanched, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. You miserable little servant. You have no idea who you're dealing with." With a brutal metallic thud, Santiago slammed a heavy combat knife straight into the center of the table, a fraction of an inch from Arthur's trembling fingers. The rival guards instinctively reached for their weapons, but Santiago just stared dead at the older man, his eyes black and merciless. "Speak to my future wife with respect, Arthur," Santiago whispered, the low, granular baritone freezing the blood in their veins. "Or this meeting ends with your throat on the floor." Sandra didn't even blink at the drawn weapons. She simply adjusted her notes, completely in control. "The terms are simple, Arthur. You surrender your remaining port contracts to the Dominguez Syndicate, sign over your real estate holdings to my management, and take your family into permanent exile out of New York. Do it, or the encrypted ledgers I hold go to the FBI, ensuring you and your son die in a federal penitentiary." Outplayed not by bullets, but by absolute brilliance, Arthur slowly lowered his head in total, broken defeat. An hour later, back in the sanctuary of their penthouse, Santiago cornered Sandra against the heavy mahogany door. The moment it clicked shut, he pulled her voluptuous frame into his arms, kissing her with a fierce, burning hunger that worshipped the very body the rest of the world had told her to hide. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the undisputed queen of the Dominguez Empire, and she was exactly where she belonged.